Welcome in, everyone. If you're joining us today, you are probably that person who really loves those aha
Oh,
moments.
for sure.
Yeah, those sudden flashes of insight that completely reframe how you see the world. But if you're anything like me, you're also probably entirely exhausted by the sheer volume of information out there right now.
It is a lot.
It's so much. You want the depth, you crave the clarity, but you don't want the overwhelm of having to sift through 100 different tabs on your browser. And the overarching theme we're going to be exploring today is a concept framed around this really central idea, which is blurring the line is not wise.
It really is a provocative starting point because at its core, what we have here is a deeply analytical look at a massive cultural shift that's happened almost entirely under the radar. We're talking about how our modern everyday culture has developed this incredibly vague, highly flexible, almost entirely elastic definition of what it actually means to be good.
Which is such a loaded word anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the document sharply contrasts that modern, incredibly comfortable definition with the very specific, highly defined will of God as it's outlined in the biblical texts.
Right.
Essentially, we're looking at a full-speed collision between modern cultural comfort and ancient scriptural clarity. Our goal, as always, is to impartially dive into the ideas presented in this material to really turn them over in our hands and understand exactly what's being argued and why it matters so much to this specific worldview.
Okay, let's unpack this because the scenario this starts with is something I think every single one of us has experienced probably within the last month.
Oh, easily.
You hear it in everyday conversations. You hear it sitting in hospital waiting rooms. You hear it constantly at funerals. It's this incredibly common, almost reflex level assumption that heaven is just the automatic default destination for anyone who is generally considered a quote unquote good person.
Yes.
If someone was nice, if they were pleasant, if they, didn't actively ruin anyone's life, the immediate cultural reflex is to say, well, they're in a better place.
That's the exact phenomenon.
Yeah.
And while that modern comfort is entirely understandable,
As it feels nice.
right, it
Yeah.
feels deeply kind, it feels compassionate, it feels like the polite, socially acceptable thing to say in a moment of grief, but it actually rests on what the source describes as a blind hope.
A blind hope.
Yeah, this cultural reflex is almost completely disconnected from any specific scriptural teaching.
Hmm.
The argument being made in the text is that this assumption, as comforting as it might be when we're facing mortality, actually directly contradicts the explicit historical teachings of Jesus found in the Bible. Relying on this vague cultural sense of goodness is actually a massive departure from clear book, chapter, and verse teaching.
So we have a fantastic roadmap for you today on this deep dive. We're going to explore why human decency isn't just a spiritual participation trophy. We're going to look at why our earnest sincerity, our good intentions, can't simply replace objective truth.
That's a huge one.
It really is. And finally, we'll examine a really counterintuitive idea, why divine clarity, which our modern ears almost always perceive as harsh, exclusive, or even bigoted, is actually presented as a profound form of mercy and safety.
It's a progression of thought that really forces you to step back. It challenges you to examine your baseline assumptions about morality, about the afterlife, and honestly, about how you measure the value of your own everyday actions.
It's so true.
So let's start by looking at this concept of the good person paradox.
Yes, let's dive right into that. Because there's a really sharp observation made right away about how we define good in our daily lives. Think about it practically. When you tell someone, oh, I have a really good neighbor, what do you actually mean by that?
You mean they aren't annoying?
Exactly. You probably mean they keep their yard tidy, they don't play loud music at 2 in the morning, and maybe they bring your empty trash cans back up the driveway when you're out of town.
Right.
And if you have a good coworker, it means they show up on time, they don't steal your lunch from the fridge, and they're pleasant to chat with by the coffee machine.
Yeah.
We're essentially describing social utility. These definitions of goodness are incredibly useful for society. They help us navigate our relationships, they keep the peace, and they make life enjoyable. But the danger highlighted here is that these everyday social definitions,
The ones that work great for a cul-de-sac.
right, which serve us perfectly well in a cul-de-sac or an office, they drift dangerously into our spiritual thinking. They quietly become the default measuring stick we assume the creator of the universe uses.
What's fascinating here is how incredibly flexible this cultural version of goodness really is. When goodness is defined by our current culture, it grades on a massive, highly forgiving curve.
Oh, huge curve.
It's a sliding scale that stretches to include almost everyone we know, and especially the people we happen to like. And when we apply this cultural measure of goodness to ourselves, we become incredibly quick to excuse our own flaws as just completely understandable byproducts of being human.
Of course we do.
We look at our mistakes and say, well, I had a hard day, or my intentions were pure, or I was under a lot of stress. But the real trick we play, and we all do this, is constant comparison. We look around, we scan the horizon, and we intentionally find someone who is visibly doing much worse than we are. And that comparison gives us this immediate false sense of security.
Oh, absolutely. It's the classic, well, I might yell at my kids sometimes and I might cheat a little on my taxes, but at least I'm not out there robbing banks or hurting people defense.
Right.
It's like we build our own personal moral hierarchy where we conveniently place ourselves right in the safe, meaty middle of the bell curve.
Precisely. We construct a sociology of goodness rather than a theology of goodness. But the critical shift we need to understand in this material is that according to the Bible, God doesn't grade on a curve at all.
Not even a little bit.
No, God doesn't line humanity up side by side to see who managed to do slightly better than the guy next to them. The biblical standard doesn't ask if you were relatively better than someone else. It asks a much more binary foundational question. Are you doing the will of the Father? To illustrate this, we have to look at the words of the Apostle Paul from the book of Romans, specifically Romans chapter 3, verse 10, which famously states, "There is none righteous, not even one."
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Because to a modern ear, that sounds incredibly harsh.
It does.
It sounds unnecessarily pessimistic. If I'm someone who genuinely spends my weekends volunteering at an animal shelter, I pay my taxes, I try to be a good spouse, and Paul comes along and says, nope, none are righteous. You're entirely unrighteous. It feels like a blanket insult. It feels like my genuine efforts are being equated with the actions of a violent criminal.
Yeah.
How do we square that without people just immediately tuning out the message as completely unfair?
That's the exact friction this brings up, and it's a brilliant question. It does sound harsh to a culture built on self-esteem, but we have to understand the context. Paul isn't writing this to monsters or historical villains. He's writing to ordinary people, many of whom were deeply religious and trying very hard to live out their faith.
Okay.
Stating none are righteous isn't meant to deny that humans perform beautiful acts of kindness, charity, or self-sacrifice. It's not a personal insult about your weekend volunteering. What Paul is doing is a profound systemic leveling of the playing field. He is entirely removing the comparison game we just talked about.
So no more bell curve.
Exactly. He's establishing that no human reaches a standard of absolute perfect goodness that can stand entirely on his own merit before a holy God. He's talking about the category of righteousness, not the degree of your daily behavioral mistakes. Once you understand that the standard is perfection, not just being better than average, you realize the ground beneath every single human being is completely level.
Wow.
The bank robber and the volunteer are on the exact same footing when it comes to earning their own salvation.
That makes a lot of sense. It takes away the currency of our good deeds. And there's that famous interaction with the wealthy young man that really drives this home. This young, incredibly successful guy who, by all accounts, was a very good, very moral person by society standards, comes up to Jesus and addresses him as good teacher. Now, normally, if someone calls you good, you just say thank you and move on. But Jesus completely stops the conversation and shifts the entire frame of reference. He pauses and says, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone." He takes this word good that the young man is tossing around casually and completely redefines it right in front of him.
Exactly. And Jesus isn't rejecting the compliment out of false modesty, and he certainly isn't denying his own divine nature. What he's doing is forcing that young man, and by extension the reader, to recognize that goodness, in its truest, most absolute, uncorrupted spiritual sense, does not begin with human effort.
It's not something we can just generate.
Right. It begins and ends with God. It is a fixed divine reality, not a human sliding scale. The young man thought he was talking to a peer who had just figured out a few more life hacks for being a moral person. Jesus is telling him, you fundamentally misunderstand what goodness actually is.
And to really hammer this point, there's some incredibly vivid, almost shocking imagery used by the ancient prophet Isaiah, specifically Isaiah 64:6, where Isaiah describes all of our righteous deeds, not our sins, mind you, but our righteous deeds, our very best efforts, as a polluted garment, or, in older translations, filthy rags.
It's incredibly strong language.
It is.
And it's intentionally jarring, especially for a modern audience that is so deeply conditioned by self-affirmation. But you have to remember who Isaiah was speaking to. He was talking to an audience of ancient Israelites who genuinely believed that their visible religious acts, their sacrifices, their temple attendance, their outward moral behavior had literally earned them security with God.
They thought they were racking up points.
Exactly. Isaiah's words are meant to violently cut through that illusion. When our good acts become a currency, when we genuinely think our decency is a coin we can slide across the counter to purchase God's favor, it no longer points us toward God. It actually points us back to ourselves. It mutates from an act of worship into a form of intense pride and self-reliance.
Which brings to mind Luke 17:10, where Jesus talks to his followers about humility. He basically says that even when you've done absolutely everything commanded of you, which none of us have, but even if you did, your attitude should still be, we are unworthy servants. We've only done our duty.
Right.
The entire point being made across all these texts is that if we use our modern cultural measures, heaven stops feeling like a profound, unearned divine gift, and it starts feeling a lot like a participation trophy.
The participation trophy analogy is brilliant because it perfectly captures the modern zeitgeist. We give participation trophies because we want to protect people from the pain of falling short. We want everyone to feel validated just for showing up. But think about what that does.
It dilutes everything.
Completely. If goodness is defined so loosely, so broadly, that literally everyone qualifies just by virtue of not being a serial killer, then the word good itself actually loses all meaning. It becomes functionally useless. What the scriptures are doing here isn't trying to leave humanity hopeless by setting a cruel, impossible standard. Rather, they're trying to leave humanity honest.
Honest. I like that.
The goal is to strip away our illusions so that we place our trust in something infinitely stronger than our own inevitably flawed, fragile human efforts or our favorable comparisons to the guy next door.
So to you listening right now, wherever you are, this poses a really challenging, deeply personal question. When you think about your own spiritual standing, or even just your own moral compass, what are you actually relying on? Are you resting on a general sense of social decency, the fact that you're polite, you tip well at restaurants, you rescue stray dogs, or are you actually seeking alignment with what's described here as the divine will?
It's a tough question to face.
Because relying on social decency feels incredibly comfortable. It feels safe. But it's a fragile, paper-thin foundation when faced with the absolute. And that realization transitions us perfectly into our next section, where we look at what Jesus actually said about who is accepted, which completely systematically shatters that illusion of universal acceptance.
Yes. Moving from the definition of goodness to the explicit teachings regarding acceptance is where the rubber really meets the road.
Yeah.
Because Jesus explicitly, repeatedly rejected the idea that everyone is automatically accepted. And he does this most notably in the Sermon on the Mount, which is fascinating because he's not talking to a bunch of pagans or outcasts at that moment. He's addressing a crowd of people who are earnest, deeply religious, and entirely confident in their own spiritual standing.
Let's talk about the specific passage that usually makes people squirm. Matthew 7:21-23. In this passage, Jesus describes a group of people who are incredibly confident. They aren't tentative, they're totally sincere. They even come right up to him saying, Lord, Lord, and they immediately point to their spiritual resumes.
Right, they list their accomplishments.
They list off these visible, impressive, almost miraculous works they've done in his name. But the absolute shock of the passage is that they are turned away. Jesus says to them, I never knew you. Depart from me. And they are turned away specifically because they failed to do the will of the Father. The surprise, the utter bewilderment of these individuals is what gives this passage its massive, terrifying weight.
It is arguably one of the most sobering passages in all of Scripture. And we connect this back to the broader theme of blurring the lines. The distinction Jesus makes here is vital. Notice what Jesus doesn't say. He doesn't question their passion. He doesn't accuse them of faking their sincerity or lacking enthusiasm.
He doesn't say they didn't do the miracles.
He doesn't even deny that they did the works they claimed to do. What he questions, what he entirely rejects, is their alignment. He points out the massive eternal difference between saying the right religious words or even doing impressive religious things and actually listening to and knowing the right voice. These people had built an entire spiritual identity around what they assumed God wanted, or perhaps what they wanted God to want. They heard what they wanted to hear, built a theology out of it, and in the process, completely missed the actual specific will of the Father. They were busy, but they were deeply, tragically misaligned.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because Jesus explores this exact concept of alignment through the incredibly famous metaphor of paths and gates. He talks about a narrow way and a broad way. And when you think about it, there's a really gentle but profound irony here regarding human nature. Because in our everyday physical lives, we absolutely love wide
Oh,
roads.
without a doubt. We engineer our entire world around them.
Right. Think about driving. If you have a long road trip ahead of you, what kind of road do you want to be on? You want the massive interstate highway. You want 5 lanes in each direction, huge caved shoulders, massive reflective signs telling you exactly where the exits are, and plenty of room to drift a little bit while you change your podcast or hand a snack to your kid in the back seat without causing a 10-car pileup. Wide roads make us feel safe because they accommodate our errors. They're forgiving. Narrow roads, on the other hand, like a winding single-lane dirt pass up the side of a mountain with a sheer drop-off and absolutely no guardrails, those make us sweat. They make us incredibly nervous.
Because you can't make a mistake.
Why? Because they demand total, unrelenting focus. They force us to slow down, to pay attention to every single foot of the terrain, and they leave absolutely zero room for error. A momentary lapse in judgment on a narrow mountain pass is catastrophic. But what's fascinating is that when it comes to spiritual reality, Jesus completely flips our natural physical instincts upside down.
That reversal is the absolute crux of the teaching. Jesus is essentially telling his listeners that the wide road, the spiritual path that feels the easiest, the most inclusive, the one that asks the fewest difficult questions and comfortably accommodates all our personal assumptions and cultural updates, is not actually the safest one. In fact, it's the most dangerous.
That's such a paradigm shift.
The broad way is broad precisely because it requires very little discernment. You can just merge onto it and flow with the cultural traffic. But the narrow way, while it might feel less comfortable, while it might require deep attention, intention, and a willingness to stand out from the crowd, is the one that actually leads to life. Jesus is warning us that direction matters immensely, and that not every sincere, well-intentioned step leads to the same destination.
And it's so important to understand the intent behind Jesus' words here. He doesn't lower the standard to make people feel safe. A lowered standard, a artificially widened road, might make people feel emotionally comfortable in the moment. It might relieve their immediate anxiety, but it leaves them entirely unchanged. It allows them to rest on a bed of assumptions that demand absolutely no response, no sacrifice, and no spiritual growth from them whatsoever.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Jesus actually raises the level of clarity precisely so that the safety might be real, rather than just imagined. Clarity invites transformation. When the path is narrow and clearly defined, it pulls people out of a vague, floaty, feel-good spirituality and invites them into a concrete, lived relationship that is actively shaped by listening, yielding, and obedience.
Yeah.
These narrow paths and high standards aren't arbitrary barriers meant to arbitrarily keep people out like a bouncer at a VIP club. They are clear, bright markers meant to keep people from wandering off a spiritual cliff while blindly trusting their own instincts.
You know, it's such a powerful reframing.
Yeah.
Because in our modern culture, we almost instinctively view any kind of high exclusive standard as inherently exclusionary or even mean-spirited. But if you look at it through this lens, the text presents the standard as a protective guardrail, which actually brings up a really difficult, almost uncomfortable tension. Because if the narrow road is required, and if people on the wide road can be incredibly sincere, incredibly passionate, and yet still be turned away at the end, well, then it logically follows that sincerity alone is simply not enough. And that means we have to dive into a deeply uncomfortable conversation about sincerity versus truth.
This is, without a doubt, one of the most culturally challenging concepts we have to tackle today. Because as modern humans, we place an incredibly high premium on sincerity. It is arguably our highest cultural virtue right now. We value it above almost anything else because it feels so authentic, so honest.
Yes, authenticity is everything right now.
When we see someone trying hard, even if they fail completely, their earnest effort alone earns our respect and our grace.
Right. Let me give you a perfect example of how this works in real life. I have a buddy who is notoriously bad in the kitchen. One year, for my birthday, he decided he was going to bake me a cake from scratch. He spent hours on it. He brings it over, I take a massive bite, and it is entirely inedible.
Well.
It turns out he had completely confused the salt for the sugar. He used like 2 cups of salt. Now, in that moment, I don't scream at him. I don't banish him from my life or tell him he's a terrible person. I laugh. I genuinely appreciate the incredible amount of earnest effort he put in. I thank him, and then I order a pizza.
Right, because he meant well.
His sincerity completely covers the objective mistake. The intention was pure, so the outcome, while gross, is forgiven.
That is the perfect everyday example of how we operate socially. Sincerity smooths over the rough edges of our incompetence. And because we operate this way with our friends and family, we very naturally let that instinct bleed over into our spiritual thinking.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We start to build a theology that says, look, as long as my spiritual intentions are good, as long as I'm genuinely trying my best to connect to the divine, the specifics of what I believe or how I act don't really matter. God will just see my heart and order the pizza.
Mm-hmm.
But the danger is that over time, sincerity has quietly stopped being a companion to truth and has actually become a substitute for it.
Yeah, we've swapped the words entirely. And there's a verse from the book of Proverbs that highlights just how dangerous this swap really is. Proverbs says, "There is a way that seems right to a person, but its end is the way of death." Now think about the chilling implications of that.
Is chilling.
The danger being warned about here isn't outright malicious, fist-shaking rebellion against God. The danger is confidence. The danger is the person who is entirely 100% convinced they are on the right path. Their intentions feel pure to them. Their direction feels entirely justified by their own internal logic and emotions. But despite all that internal validation, they are objectively heading toward a cliff.
This raises an important question, and we can explore it through the writings of the Apostle Paul, specifically his letter to the churches in Galatia. Paul writes to the Galatians with this tone of utter astonishment, almost panic, because they are quickly turning to what he calls a different gospel. Now, we need to understand the historical context here. These Galatians hadn't suddenly become secular atheists. They hadn't abandoned religion to go live hedonistic lifestyles. They were still deeply religious. They were still meeting together. They were still incredibly sincere in their devotion. What had changed wasn't their fervor. What had changed was the core message they were accepting and building their lives upon. They were tweaking the truth.
And a different gospel, which today usually presents itself as being slightly more inclusive, slightly more reasonable to modern sensibilities, or more compassionate than the ancient texts, almost always works by stripping away the parts of the truth that are offensive, difficult, or socially awkward.
Exactly.
But the massive takeaway from Paul's absolute panic here is this: truth does not become truer by being artificially widened to make everyone feel comfortable. If you reshape the truth, if you file down all its sharp edges so it fits neatly into the modern cultural puzzle, it literally stops being the truth. It mutates into something else entirely.
We can cement this concept with a really simple, highly relatable analogy. Imagine you are about to head out on a hike. You have a map, you have your compass, and you set off. You are following your directions with absolute, unwavering conviction. You are walking with immense purpose, your pace is brisk, your heart rate is up, and you are completely, thoroughly sincere in your belief that you are heading toward the beautiful lake at the end of the trail.
Sounds like a great hike.
The only problem is you're walking in the exact wrong direction. You read the compass backward. Now, the tragedy here lies entirely in the confidence, not just the mistake. Being incredibly earnest, sweating, and putting in the miles does not magically make the error harmless. Walking with intense purpose does not guarantee you are headed toward life if the map you are using is fundamentally flawed, or worse, completely upside down.
Exactly. I actually had this happen on a road trip through Nevada a few years ago. I was so sure I knew a shortcut. My GPS was telling me to turn around, but I stubbornly thought, no, I've got a great gut feeling about this dirt road. Look at the mountains. This has to be the way.
We've all been there.
I was incredibly sincere about getting to our destination faster, but my sincerity didn't change the fact that an hour later I was stuck in the middle of a literal desert with no cell service, surrounded by sagebrush, dangerously low on gas. My sincerity didn't teleport me to where I needed to be. It just got me incredibly far away from my destination, very quickly.
That is a phenomenal illustration. And if we look at Paul again, specifically his famous encounter in Athens, we see how he handles this exact dynamic. Paul is standing in the Areopagus, essentially the cultural and philosophical epicenter of the ancient world. It's a place where every idea is debated, every deity has an altar, and pluralism is the law of the land.
Honestly, it sounds remarkably like a modern social media feed.
It really does. So Paul looks around, he observes their many altars, including one to an unknown God, and he actually begins by acknowledging their deep sincerity. He says, I see that in every way you are very religious. He doesn't start by calling them lazy, stupid, or insincere. But, and this is the absolute crux of the argument, despite acknowledging their profound sincerity, he still calls them to repent.
Which is a heavy word.
It is. He called them to fundamentally change their minds and their direction based on the revelation of Jesus. Repentance, in this context, is not an insult to someone's sincerity. It is a necessary invitation to let objective truth redirect what sincerity alone simply cannot correct.
I think that's such a vital distinction.
Oh, yeah.
Sincerity is great for explaining how or why someone arrived at a certain belief. It tells their story, it generates empathy. But sincerity does not possess the magical power to make that belief objectively true, safe, or holy.
Right.
So, turning this back to you, the listener, this presents a really challenging mirror to hold up. Are you simply trusting your own earnestness, your own gut feelings, or good intentions to carry you through your spiritual life? Or are you actively willing to let objective truth, even when it's uncomfortable, correct you when your sincerity inevitably leads you off the map? It really boils down to a question of ultimate authority. When your feelings and the truth collide, which one has the right of way in your life?
And following that logical progression leads us directly into the next major paradigm shift. Because if truth is truly that vital, and if sincerity without truth is actually dangerous, then the obvious question is, how do we know the truth? Has God left us to just guess in the dark?
Right.
The argument presented here is that God has emphatically not left humanity to guess. God has revealed a specific way and guards it carefully. And this brings us to what we might call the mercy of precision.
Now, this is where we really have to dig into the psychology of ambiguity because, let's be honest, modern people actually find a massive amount of comfort in things being left undefined.
Yeah.
If the rules of salvation, or the definition of a good life, or the exact nature of the spiritual path are kept vague and flexible, then you really can't ever get it wrong.
Right.
The uncertainty itself acts as a massive cultural safety net. We live in a society where definitions of gender, of marriage, of success, of morality, they change practically daily. So we just instinctively assume that God operates the same way, constantly updating the cosmic terms of service to accommodate everyone's current comfort level.
We project our cultural fluidity onto the divine. However, the biblical text paints a starkly, almost shockingly different picture of God. It portrays a God who is not silent, who is not ambiguous, and who is certainly not constantly crowdsourcing revisions to the rules.
Definitely not.
It portrays a God who is highly purposeful and intensely, undeniably clear. Take, for instance, the night before Jesus' crucifixion. The context here is crucial. His disciples are terrified. They are anxious, they are confused, their entire world is about to violently collapse, and they are deeply unsettled about the future. And in that moment of extreme, palpable tension, Jesus does not offer them a vague, philosophical platitude.
He doesn't just say, follow your heart.
He doesn't say, just follow your hearts, guys. All paths lead up the mountain. He looks at them and says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.
I love that you brought up the context because it completely changes how you hear that verse. We usually hear that verse quoted defensively, almost like a weapon to shut down debate.
Right, in arguments.
But Jesus isn't saying this to flex his theological authority or to be aggressively exclusionary in a mean-spirited way. He is offering these highly specific words to deeply anxious friends as an anchor in a raging storm. The exclusivity of the claim, I am the way, was specifically meant to steady their hearts, not to unsettle them. It anchors their hope in a specific, tangible person that they know and trust, rather than leaving them drifting in some abstract, shifting philosophical fog.
Exactly. The exclusivity is the source of the comfort. And we see this echoed shortly after by the Apostle Peter. Peter is standing in Jerusalem, speaking to the religious leaders, the very people who just had Jesus executed, and he echoes this exact same unflinching exclusivity. He states, regarding Jesus, that there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved.
And considering who is talking.
Now, it's vital to remember who is speaking here. This is Peter, the guy who, just weeks prior, had completely failed, panicked, and publicly denied even knowing Jesus. Peter isn't speaking out of a sense of cultural dominance, intellectual superiority, or arrogance. He's speaking as a drowning man who is miraculously pulled into a life raft. He's simply pointing everyone else to the exact same specific life raft that saved him, rather than pretending that any random piece of driftwood floating by will work just as well.
The text also brings up the book of Revelation, which contains that incredibly severe warning at the very end against anyone adding to or subtracting from the words of the prophecy. Now, again, our modern instinct is to read that and think, wow, God is really insecure about his book. But if you look deeper, it's not a threat from an insecure deity. It's a critical, loving safeguard. Think about medicine. If truth is constantly adjusted, if you shave a little off here because it's unpopular and you add a little modern psychology there just to make it fit the current cultural moment more comfortably, it slowly but inevitably loses its actual power to cure the disease. It becomes a diluted, ineffective placebo.
That leads us to what I consider the most compelling and convicting analogy we've discussed today, the concept of the doctor and the bridge. We have this bizarre, deeply ingrained tendency, especially when it comes to spiritual matters, to treat firm boundaries, precise instructions, and exclusive claims as glaring signs of narrow-mindedness, bigotry, or unkindness.
Right. If someone stands up today and says, this specific way is the only way to God, the immediate knee-jerk cultural reflex is to say, wow, that is incredibly intolerant, unloving, and toxic.
Precisely. But let's step out of the spiritual realm for a second and look at how we behave in the physical world. If you go to a specialist, let's say an oncologist, with a serious life-threatening illness, you absolutely do not want that doctor to be vague or inclusive with your treatment plan.
Absolutely not.
You do not want them to look at your scans and say, well, my truth is chemotherapy, but if your truth is drinking celery juice and meditating with crystals, then whatever medicine feels right to your heart is the right medicine for you. You would sue that doctor for malpractice. You want extreme, unapologetic precision. You want the exact specific diagnosis, the exact surgical procedure, and the exact dosage of the medication required to save your life.
Oh, or think about civil engineering. If you are driving your family up to a massive suspension bridge spanning a 1,000-foot gorge, you do not want a wooden sign at the entrance that says, this bridge represents one of many equally valid ways to cross this gorge. Just believe deeply in its structural integrity and you'll be fine. No. You want a sign clearly, definitively marked by an engineer that says safe or unsafe. You want to know the exact weight limit. You want rigid, inflexible laws of physics applied to that steel.
We absolutely celebrate demand and pay top dollar for clarity when it protects our physical bodies. We recognize precision as a massive life-saving benefit. But the massive hypocrisy is how we treat spiritual reality. We aggressively resist that exact same precision in our faith.
That's so true.
We pretend that true love requires everything to be loose, undefined, and affirming of every possible choice. But the biblical argument is the exact opposite. True love speaks with absolute, unflinching clarity, precisely because what is at stake is of ultimate eternal importance.
It's just a devastatingly logical point. God doesn't guard the narrow way because he's a cosmic killjoy who wants to arbitrarily exclude people from the party. He guards the narrow way because he actually wants people to arrive safely at the destination. A clearly marked path with firm, unyielding boundaries is not a barrier to your joy. It is a profound, calculated mercy. When we culturally revise the path, when we bulldoze the guardrails in the name of being loving, tolerant, or inclusive, we might feel incredibly generous and progressive in the moment. We might get a lot of likes on social media, but we are actually risking leading people blindfolded toward a cliff.
So true.
So what does this all mean for you, the person listening to this right now? If God has clearly marked the path out of mercy, and if that path is admittedly narrow and specific, how are we supposed to walk it without just being crushed by the weight of rules and anxiety? That brings us to the final major theme we need to unpack. The critical difference between allowing yourself to be actively formed by the Word versus simply using religion to seek moral comfort.
This section really cuts to the core of the psychology of modern faith. There is this quiet, persistent, almost gravitational pull inside all of us toward what we can call moral comfort. We desperately want our faith to function like a warm, heavy blanket on a cold night. We want it to constantly reassure us, to pat us on the head, to tell us we are fundamentally acceptable exactly as we are, and above all, to demand absolutely no difficult, painful adjustments to our lifestyle, our habits, or our desires.
And to be fair, comfort isn't inherently evil. The scriptures are full of verses that offer deep, profound comfort to the weary, the brokenhearted, and the grieving. But the problem arises when comfort ceases to be a beautiful byproduct of faith and slowly becomes the ultimate defining goal of the faith.
Exactly.
When your religion exists purely to soothe your anxieties and affirm your life choices, it stops actively forming you. It becomes a mirror instead of a window. We start valuing the emotional payoff, the good vibes of belief, far more than we value the difficult, daily, gritty practice of faithful living.
To counter this deeply ingrained desire for mere comfort, we have to look at the Great Commission, Jesus' final parting instructions to his followers before he ascends. It's his mission statement for the church. Notice a crucial, often overlooked detail. Jesus did not tell his disciples to go out into all the world and make converts who feel totally secure and affirmed. He explicitly told them to go and make disciples, baptizing them and teaching them to observe all that he commanded. That word, observe, is the linchpin. It is not about a one-time intellectual agreement. It's not about walking an aisle, saying a prayer, and then living however you want. Observing implies ongoing practice, sustained listening, discipline, and a life that is actively, sometimes painfully, shaped and molded over a long period of time.
It makes me think of the difference between joining a gym and actually working out. Anyone can walk into a gym on January 1st, sign a contract, and get the little plastic barcode for their keychain. And having that barcode in your wallet might make you feel really good about yourself.
Oh, for sure.
You might feel a sense of comfort knowing you are technically a member, but you don't get the physical results just by carrying the card. You don't get stronger by association. You have to actually show up, sweat, tear the muscle fibers, and observe the discipline of the workouts.
That's a perfect parallel. And you see this exact mindset in the early church leaders. The Apostle Paul is constantly urging early believers to stand firm, to hold fast to the specific teachings they received, even when it cost them socially or physically. The Apostle John writes extensively in his letters about abiding in the teaching of Christ.
Abiding.
Abiding is a fascinating word. It means staying put. It means sinking deep roots and resisting the overwhelming cultural urge to constantly update, tweak, or modernize your theology every time the cultural winds shift in a new direction.
But wait, let's address the elephant in the room here, because for a lot of people, the moment they hear words like obedience, observe, discipline, or abiding, their alarm bells go off.
Oh, absolutely.
They immediately think of legalism. They think of oppressive religious systems where you are desperately sweating on a spiritual treadmill, trying to earn your way into heaven by being good enough. How do we reconcile this call for intense obedience with the concept of grace?
That is perhaps the most common theological stumbling block in the modern church, and it requires a vital razor-sharp distinction. Grace is not opposed to obedience. Let me say that again. Grace is not the opposite of obedience. Grace is the opposite of earning.
Okay, unpack that, because that is huge.
Earning says, I did X, Y, and Z. Therefore, God is in my debt and owes me salvation. That is legalism, and it is entirely rejected by the New Testament. Grace, on the other hand, says, I was spiritually dead, completely incapable of saving myself, and God freely rescued me at immense cost to himself. Grace completely frees a person from the exhausting, impossible illusion that they can save themselves through their own effort. But, and this is the crucial part, grace does not free you from listening to, submitting to, and obeying the master who actually did save you. In fact, true grace is the very fuel that makes joyful obedience possible.
That distinction changes everything. It changes obedience from a fearful chore into a grateful response. And if we bring it back to the boundary analogy one more time, it makes this incredibly practical. Think about property lines or speed limits in school zones or the complex instruction manual for operating heavy machinery. We actually like these boundaries in our physical lives because they provide stability. They prevent chaos. They tell us how things are actually designed to work. But spiritually, we tend to treat God's boundaries as oppressive, outdated burdens keeping us from our truest selves. What we're seeing here is that the goal of the biblical gospel is not to just pat you on the back, affirm all your desires, and leave you exactly as broken and confused as it found you. The goal is for you to be taught, corrected, healed, and continuously formed by God's word into something entirely new.
And we have to be honest about the reality of that process. Faithfulness, truly observing and abiding, is not always going to feel comfortable. It will inevitably cause friction in your life. It will put you at odds with the broader culture. It will require you to change habits, abandon certain desires, and submit your will to someone else. But the profound promise of the text is that this difficult, sometimes painful faithfulness carries a much deeper, more resilient, eternal peace than the incredibly fragile, fleeting comfort of modern, vague spirituality.
Which brings us to the culmination of this incredibly journey through the source material. Let's synthesize exactly what we've unpacked today. We started with this culturally pervasive idea that treating heaven as an automatic default destination for anyone who is generally nice or socially decent feels like a kind, compassionate thing to say. But when held up to the light of actual scripture, it's revealed to be ultimately incredibly careless, like giving someone wrong directions with a smile.
Yes. We've methodically walked through the case that Jesus' clarity, his unyielding insistence on a narrow path, a specific gate, and absolute alignment with the Father's will is not a restriction born of cruelty or narrow-mindedness. It's a profound, life-saving relief born of infinite mercy. He did not multiply the options to confuse humanity. He did not leave us in a philosophical fog. He gave a single, incredibly clear, illuminated route out of the darkness.
Yeah.
True love, biblically defined, is not affirming everyone's individual choices. It is listening to what God has actually specifically said
Yeah.
and trusting his divine eternal wisdom over our own deeply flawed, highly changeable human instincts.
So bringing this directly to you, the learner. As you digest all these arguments, all these analogies about roads and doctors and bridges, the challenge you're left with is deeply personal. Are you seeking a belief system that simply acts as a moral pacifier, something to just keep you comfortable, soothe your anxiety, and affirm all your current choices? Or are you genuinely seeking a faith that keeps you anchored to objective truth, even when that truth hurts, even when it requires you to change direction? Are you willing to be taught, to be corrected, and to be actively formed by the truth, rather than just being comforted by a culturally acceptable illusion?
And if we connect all of this to the absolute biggest picture possible, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, something that builds directly on our analogy of the doctor and the bridge. We've talked a lot about the friction that strict boundaries cause. But what if the narrow path is truly a manifestation of a divine doctor's perfect precision? What if the friction, the pushback, the discomfort we sometimes feel when encountering these strict spiritual boundaries isn't actually a sign that we are being restricted, oppressed, or kept from living our best lives? What if that exact friction is actually the very sensation of being actively, lovingly protected from a danger we simply cannot see yet?
Wow. Friction as active protection. That is a brilliant perspective-shifting thought to end on. If you bump up against the guardrail, it means the guardrail is doing its job. We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it challenged you, provoked some new thoughts, and helped clear the fog. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.